Welcome to Communicast, a communication skills podcast. I'm Scott D'Amico, president of Communispond. On today's episode, I'm chatting with Pat DiLaura, Chief Talent Officer at Logical Operations, the leading provider of instructor-led technology training curriculum and digital learning tools. Pat shares his experiences from his extensive career in HR and talent management, as well as his time in the Army, where he hits on the importance of not taking the I wear the stars and you wear the bars approach to leadership and communication. I hope you enjoy. Pat, thank you so much for joining me today. If you can, to get us kicked off, maybe just tell the listeners out there a little about yourself, your background, and the work that you're doing today.
Sure. Yes. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. So thank you for the invitation, Scott. As I sort of processed the invitation, I thought to myself, this is a great opportunity to share. So share some of the many years of experience I have in the human resources field. I'll go back even a little farther than that. I started as an Army officer and had some of the most formative experiences in my life during those 4 years on active duty. I worked for some leaders who were tremendous communicators and learned, through example, some behaviors that have served me well over the years, particularly as an HR professional. So I've been working in the human resource field now for about 34 years. Worked for some terrific organizations, Hallmark Cards in Kansas City, MasterCard International in St. Louis. I was head of HR for a technology company out of New York called Ziff-Davis. And more recently, I also headed up a human resources company that had offices in multiple states. And then most recently, I served as head of the chief human resources officer for a company called Klein Steel in Rochester, New York. Currently, I'm serving as chief talent officer for a company called Logical Operations, which is a technology publisher, training company, and certification company. And I've been doing that for about 3 years. So it's been a joy to serve in the human resource field. It's been a tremendous experience to work with and for some tremendous leaders. So that's a little snapshot of my professional background.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And I love kind of the point you brought up around just learning, especially from the military, from great leaders, honing those communication skills. And you just imagine in an organization within the military, the importance of communication, where it literally is very critical, right, to get things right and to get that message across. So I want to come back to that a little bit later, just hearing about some of those experiences or some of those leaders and really how that helped shape your communication skills and in your career.
Sure.
And if I think through that experience that you just shared from a number of different companies, large and small, across a wide variety of industries. Mm-hmm. And I would have to think throughout your career, and especially now in the talent space, as you're doing a lot for trying to find talent, source talent, you've had people come to you, or you're having those conversations with your internal clients, and they're giving you the wish list, right, of the ideal candidate, who they're looking for, going through the laundry list of things that they must have. And sure. Invariably, I'm sure communication skills comes up. This person needs to have great communication skills, and then they probably leave it at that. But when you hear that, right, when you hear this candidate needs to have great communication skills, what does that mean to you? How do you define that?
It's a great question, Scott. And to me, you often hear that term, it factor, right? What is the it factor that's going to help that person be successful? And I think that the answer to that question is different in every organization. But one of the things that I think is a common thread for all organizations is the ability to communicate clearly, effectively, your needs and your wants, so that you can better serve your customer, whether that be an internal customer or an external customer. And I think there are certain elements that go into that. To consider someone to be an effective communicator and to possess that it factor, I think there are certain elements that are common in my experience.
So what would you say some of those elements are? What do you specifically look for when you're interviewing somebody or meeting with somebody for a potential role?
Sure. And again, this is one of those common threads, I would say, Scott, whether you're talking about a technology company or a manufacturing company, the military, a not-for-profit, you fill in the blank. I think it's the same. For me, some of those elements are the ability to build a rapport with someone. Just as you and I chatted for a few minutes before we transitioned over to the business at hand, to connect with somebody on a personal level, to better understand the person you're about to communicate with, I think helps establish a trust. And when there's trust in relationship, people tend to be more authentic and they tend to speak more freely and honestly. So I think rapport building is certainly one of those important elements for a good communicator. Being able to actively listen. So, oftentimes I think people are more concerned about being heard than they are about understanding. And so you miss opportunities to really understand what the needs of the other person are. What are they trying to accomplish in this conversation? So I think, actively listening, stopping yourself from that urge to speak and instead patiently listening, and whatever strategy you need to use to make that happen is good. But really making a point of listening to what the person's saying, good eye contact, good attention, good posture, those things that seem so basic, but are also important. So actively listening, feeding back what you're hearing so that the person on the other end knows that you care and knows that you're listening and knows that you're understanding. So I would say that's one of those common elements. Clarity of thought and message. Organizing your thoughts before you go into a conversation, understanding what outcomes you're looking for from that conversation. Whether it's a business transaction or a job interview or whatever else it may be, going into the conversation with a plan and a desired outcome so that you know where you're starting and you know where you need to finish. So I think, having that organization of thought and clarity of communication two ways is one of those important elements. And this is something that the next thing I wanted to mention is every bit as important as everything else. And that is respecting the person you're talking to, whether you are the senior person in the conversation or the junior person, whether you are a person who needs something or a person who is the resource, the provider of the information. I think that is also important just in human relations in general, but particularly when you're talking about communicating in a business transaction. Showing that you care, but most importantly, respecting the person that you're talking to and showing that in the way that you communicate. Excuse me. And the last thing I wanted to just touch on, Scott, is contracting for outcomes. And so what do I mean by contracting for outcomes? Excuse me. One of the very best courses that I took early in my professional career had to do with contracting conversations. And what that meant was, again, using some of the skills I just mentioned, to understand what the desired outcomes are, to understand what the needs of the other person are, to clarify what those needs are. And then once you understand what they are, you agree on what the outcome needs to be. Verbally contracting. Okay, so kind of summarizing what you heard, summarizing what you've agreed on, agreeing on what a delivery date is, agreeing on what's going to be needed in order to make that happen, and then walking away with a shared understanding. And that might even involve circling back with an email or a text message, summarizing what you heard, what you understood, what you agreed on, and what you're going to both do, what your shared responsibilities are in making that happen. So some of these things you listen to and you say, gee, that sounds so basic.
Mm-hmm.
But truly, with my 34 years in the HR world, having guided some performance managed counselings, have many over the years, unfortunately, having provided coaching and mentoring to people who are on their way up in an organization, helping them to identify and avoid obstacles in their career. That's some of the most basic but meaningful advice I can share. So those are some of the elements that I was referring to.
Love it. And we hear this a lot, as we're interacting with clients or participants, that, oh, well, these skills are pretty basic, right? And if you think of communication skills, you can call them basic, whatever you want to call it. But for me, it's the execution, right? It's how do you actually execute and implement and use these skills, regardless if they're basic, challenging, easy, whatever. It ultimately comes down to the execution of the skills. And what I love about your response there is you really kind of took from beginning of, you really need to prepare for your conversations, whether it's a conversation at home with a one-on-one with a colleague, if it's an interview, kind of preparing, you're understanding the organization, what are they trying to do? You need to define your outcomes. That is, for me, is huge. And I can't tell you how many times throughout my career where, I'll be talking with the sales rep and they say, oh, I just had a great meeting with so-and-so at this organization. I'm like, oh, how do you know it was great?
Right.
And then they're kind of stumped. They don't know how to answer because they never set out what the objectives for that meeting were. It may have been a nice meeting. People were open and talking and chatting. They had lunch, whatever. But if you don't set those outcomes, how do you measure against the success of that? And then implementing those skills of listening and showing respect and building rapport. And then at the end, as you mentioned, contracting for the outcomes. Really kind of, making sure you're both on the same page. So I understand you're looking for this in a candidate, these three things, here's what the process looks like and the next steps. Is that correct? And then, moving it forward. So no, that is great to hear that. And I would agree. That's kind of the thread that runs along any industry, any level within an industry, at home, at work. Kind of following that path will definitely help, to drive effective communication. So awesome. Thank you for that.
Oh, my pleasure. One additional thought I'll share too. Oftentimes when you hear people talking about communication these days, they're talking more about the mediums for communication. Are you on Twitter? Are you in social? What social media accounts do you have? Those are certainly important things to be talking about and understanding and using to communicate effectively. But I think what you and I are talking about here today are the basic skills, regardless of the medium you're choosing. I think those skills and those elements apply equally to basic human interaction as you and I are doing today, or communicating by email or text message or fill in the blank.
Yeah, I think they are. Those are the foundational skills. And over the past 18 months, we've seen, really a tremendous amount of change in our world specifically, and, in the work environment as well, working at the office, working from home, hybrid, a combination of all of the above. If you think about those foundational skills that we just discussed, have you seen any shifts, or has one or two of those skills really jumped up as being now more important that people should be really focusing on now because of the environment that we're in?
Yeah, I mean, a great question, a very relevant question. I think so. I mean, I think there's again, as you said, I think all these skills apply equally regardless. But in this very unique time that we're all living in right now, where a lot of business is being done via, teleconference, video conference, to keep it a little more generic. I think the respect, the active listening skills, the rapport building are probably all the more important, because you have the additional challenge of not being able to read all of the nonverbal skills, the nonverbal communication that's taking place. You can't necessarily judge the person's posture, the person's body language, so to speak. So I think that makes it a bit more challenging. And so the things that you do have the ability to control, the eye contact, the pace in your voice, the enthusiasm in your voice, which all goes toward building rapport, and being your authentic self. I think those things are all the more important, given what's going on in the world today. And oh, by the way, we're all interacting more via video conference and using other forms of technology. And for today, we're saying that it's a temporary thing, but I think what we're finding is that it's a very useful business tool that we will continue to utilize, and probably on a very broad basis. So I don't think it's going away. I really don't.
Yeah, I would have to agree, just from some of the client experiences that we're seeing, where they're seeing sustained results, they're seeing improved results, and then on the back end of it, they're looking at the savings that they're realizing from T&E, as well as employee engagement, where people maybe aren't getting as burned out from constantly traveling, playing catch up, things like that. So I do think this is something that brings a lot of value, and organizations are going to continue to look at how do they best leverage that. And a couple of the points that you hit on is this idea of we don't have the luxury at this point right now for always having the face-to-face interactions, where you just can pick up on so much more. If somebody's having an off day, or they're just drained, or you can tell something's really weighing on them. So this idea of making sure that you are leading with empathy and kindness and understanding, working to build rapport with people, and then being aware from your side of the quote, the non-verbal or some of the physical skills, not necessarily your posture or your gesturing at that point, if it's on the phone or something like that, your tone, your inflection, your pace, your pauses, all that stuff. And just last week, I was on a client call where they were talking, this person's been with the organization, for several months now, and they haven't met any of their teammates, right? They're really excited about that, but you're working with these people that you maybe have never met in person before. So kind of really honing in on some of those skills like listening and effective questioning that can ultimately lead to building that stronger rapport with your teammates. So yeah, spot on.
Absolutely.
So if you think through your career, you've had a very successful career, from the military, transitioning into HR, working for some large organizations in the top positions, kind of doing your own thing, and kind of leading talent now. What are some of the skills, if you just reflect back, think about yourself, what are some of the skills that really have helped drive your success?
Those elements we've been talking about, Scott, certainly apply universally, and those are tried and true. And I will say, probably as I look back over my career, it would be the rapport building, establishing relationships based on trust. And how do you establish relationships based on trust? I think it's being able to listen and understand what the needs of the other person are, the ability to deliver on commitments that are made, which gets back to the contracting for outcomes. When you say you're going to do something, do it. And
novel idea.
It's a novel idea, but it's amazing how effective that is in building trust in relationships. And when you build that trust, people view you as a resource. And when they view you as a resource, they're going to continue to come back to you for counsel and advice and for results. So I would say, again, spend that time, invest that time in building relationships and building rapport, in actively listening to the other person, showing them you care, being an authentic person with them, and getting to know them, getting to understand their needs, contracting for results, delivering those results, and keeping in touch to make sure that that person's needs are always being met. That set of skills, I think, has served me well for the past 34 plus years when you take into consideration the time in the military. And I mentioned up front that those 4 years on active duty were formative years for me. And they absolutely were. And particularly when we talk about a topic like communication, because I did have an opportunity to witness firsthand what highly effective communicators look like and how they behave. And look like, of course, meaning the way they behave. And I will say, and this kind of circles back to something you and I talked about briefly. My third year on active duty, I served as aide-de-camp to the commanding general of what was then the 3rd ROTC region in Kansas. And he had just been promoted to brigadier general, which is 1 star. And I was his first aide-de-camp as a general. This general exhibited communication skills that were well beyond anything I had ever seen to that point in my career. And what do I mean by that? He was someone who communicated with respect. He made eye contact from the moment you started speaking. He made eye contact and held eye contact and actively listened. And you knew that by him, nodding his head, showing interest, the body posture, you were his singular focus, and you knew that. And he respected you. Now, here I was, a young first lieutenant, and he's a general. He could have very easily said, you know what? This is what I need. Go do it. I'm wearing the stars. You're wearing the bars. Stars don't rank bars. He chose not to do that. And because of that, he earned my respect from the first minute. And I would have, as they say, I would have run through a wall for him because I respected him and because I knew he respected me. And he took the time to understand who I was as a person and to build a rapport with me. And just an example of that, I remember, part of what we did in the summertime was we flew around from one training site to another to conduct an inspection and to talk to the instructors and the students and get to know people, right? And I remember landing at this one training site. And we got off the helicopter and we split up. He'd go one way, I'd go the other way. We'd inspect, and then we'd get back together on the helicopter and sort of debrief on what we saw. So this one day, we landed, and there was a weapon that was unattended that was laying up against a bleacher. Now, for anyone who's served in the military, and for those who haven't too, I'm sure you can well understand what a big no-no that is.
I would imagine so, yes.
That's a big one. So I spotted the weapon unattended, and I mentioned it to him, and he called the instructor or the instructor in charge over with me standing there. And, as you might think that, this was going to be a really bad moment for the instructor, right? Here's a general who's about to point out a pretty serious mistake. When most people would have raised their voice and gotten excited about it, the general lowered his voice so the instructor would listen more closely. And he didn't berate him. He thanked him for all the good work he was doing. And he asked him what some of the challenges were. And then he pointed out to him, are you aware that? And he turned it into a teaching moment. Right. Now, that instructor never made that mistake again, to the best of my knowledge. And that instructor spoke in very glowing terms about the general and how respectful the general was and how much he learned from that conversation. Yeah. Now, that was an opportunity to blow up that relationship and never have a chance to touch that or to reach that person again. But instead, he turned it around. That to me, and I stood 5 feet away and listened to the whole conversation. that to me was a learning moment, not just for that instructor, but for a young lieutenant who had an opportunity to learn as well, and to incorporate those behaviors into the way that I tried to communicate with others. So, pay attention and invest in yourself. Now, it just so happens that I got a tuition-free lesson from that interaction. But I would say this, as a person who's junior in your career, who's wanting to climb that ladder, invest in yourself. And what I mean by that is find a mentor, someone who can guide you, help you understand what those hurdles are in your career. And just as importantly, invest the time and money when necessary to go through training, to learn what these basic skills are, what they look like, how you use them to manage your own success. You'll be doing yourself a favor, and you'll be doing your organization a favor. And again, particularly, when you're on your way up in your career. But of course, that applies equally to anyone who failed to understand those lessons earlier, because it'll serve you well no matter where you are in your career and in life, frankly.
Absolutely. And wow, there's so much there that was a fascinating story with, kind of painting the picture of that general and the idea of I wear the stars, you wear the bars. And you just see so many parallels into the workplace. You have a high level executive communicating with maybe a frontline manager or a frontline employee, where sometimes it can be, I need this, go do it, versus, building that relationship, building that rapport. And if you're thinking back to that example that you shared, where that general could have just flipped out on the person who left the weapon unattended, like you kind of stereotypically may think of what you see in a military movie, how that conversation may go. And chances are, had they done that, they probably wouldn't have made that mistake again. But in this scenario, they built a fan, they built a follower, they helped educate that person, and then hopefully they'll carry that forward to their interactions with other people. And as you kind of see that ripple effect of positive communication, as you mentioned, you got your tuition-free education on that one. I'm sure you had some scenarios where maybe you paid some tuition along the way to get that education. But, kind of this idea of, how you communicate with people matters. And, I love the point kind of, I was just going to ask you, closing thoughts, advice you would give. I think you nailed it. Invest in yourself. Whether you are an entrepreneur on your own, you're frontline employee, high level leader, invest in yourself. Ask for the resources to do it. Find the resources to do it. Whether it is formal training, just reading, picking up new skills, it's going to help to make you relevant, keep you relevant, and keep you moving forward in your career.
Absolutely. No one saw this pandemic coming 2 years ago, right? And the people who were best able to adapt were the people who had skills and had perspective. Yes. And the only way to do that is to continue, as you said, Scott, continue to grow, continue to invest in yourself. You never know when you're going to need that next big idea or have to use those skills that you learned along the way. And if you're not constantly growing, you're stagnating.
Yep.
So no, well said. Well said.
Perfect. Well, Pat, thank you so much for joining me today. I really do appreciate it, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Scott. My pleasure, and all the best to you. Have a great day.
Thank you. A special thank you again to my guest, Pat DiLaura from Logical Operations. A couple of takeaways for me: contract for outcomes, invest in yourself, and be sure to take advantage of those tuition-free lessons, meaning not only learn from your own experiences, but from those around you, great leaders, maybe not so great leaders, things that you observe from others, their successes and maybe their setbacks. Always learn from those to take yourself to the next level. I hope you enjoyed. Please be sure to subscribe to the podcast to be notified of new episodes. Thanks, and have a great day.